lymphatic system is a system that works with both the cardiovascular system and the immune systems to kind of help circulate fluid, circulate immune cells. So we're going to look mostly at, we're looking at the lymphatic system today, and then starting on Thursday we'll talk about the immune system, which tends to be its bigger role. So first let's talk about the functions of the lymphatic system. So the first and most important probably function is fluid recovery. So our lymphatic vessels collect that extra interstitial fluid that's not picked back up in our blood vessels. So if you remember when we talked about capillary exchange, only about 85% of the fluid that left on the arterial side is picked back up on the venous side. So a huge role of the lymphatic system is to have these lymphatic vessels that recover the rest of the fluid and return it to the blood. So we'll say the lymphatic vessels pick up the 15% of interstitial fluid that was left behind after capillary exchange. After I'm done going through the lecture, I'll show you some images of what happens when this part of the system fails, when you can't recover fluid. There are some videos out there that you can watch on YouTube and things that are varying degrees of educational about it, but it's definitely a system that not many people think about, but when something goes wrong, it changes your life forever. So I'll show you some images of what happens with that. The next important function of the lymphatic system is going to help to provide immunity. So our secondary structures hold large stores of immune cells so that we can initiate and mount immune responses. Another thing that is going to help with immunity is that fluid that's being picked up in the capillary or after capillary exchange is going to run by lymph nodes at prescribed points in the body, and so we can filter that fluid that's called lymph, and in those lymph nodes we've got cells then that can see if there's anything going on in the lymph, like if you get a cut in your hand, then you can pick up the bacteria in the lymph that's going past, and as soon as it hits a lymph node then we can expose that bacteria to immune cells. So we can also say that we filter this fluid called lymph to look for pathogens. So the fluid recovery role is really helping the cardiovascular system pick up that extra fluid and bring it back to the blood. This immunity role is helping the immune system that we'll talk about next. Then kind of a weird function, the last function, is that it helps with lipid absorption. So there are these specialized structures in the small intestine called lacteals that pick up our lipids, and they deliver them to this enlarged region that we'll look at called the cisterna chyli. So we'll say specialized structures called lacteals in the small intestine pick up our lipids and are going to dump them into lymph. Structures of the lacteals are in the small intestine. Alright, so figure 21.1 in your book shows all of our lymphatic structures, and we've got lymphatic vessels and then lymphatic organs. So if we look at our lymphatic vessels, first let's just define what lymph is. Lymph is this fluid flowing through our lymphatic vessels, and it's almost the exact same composition as plasma, but it doesn't have proteins in it. So remember, most of our big proteins aren't going to get filtered out in capillary exchange. So our lymph has the same stuff as plasma, but it's lacking proteins. So almost the same composition as plasma. But lacks proteins. So it's kind it's very similar to interstitial fluid. So if you think about what happened in capillary exchange, on the arterial side we push out large amounts of plasma and all the small dissolved solutes. So ions, hormones, vitamins, minerals can all get pushed out that way, and then the colloid osmotic pressure is going to push most of that back in. So all of that fluid sitting out there in the interstitial fluid that's not getting picked back up is what's going to be picked up in our lymphatic vessels and become lymph. So it's pretty close in composition to interstitial fluid as well. You could think of it as being very close to interstitial fluids. So lymphatic vessels are going to be the vessels that return the lymph. They pick it up and return it to the blood, and we've got different types. So we'll talk about each type in a minute. So the lymphatic vessels is this third type of vessel that runs with our blood vessels and is picking up this extra fluid and returning it to the blood. So they're going to return fluid to the blood. And our lymphatic vessels begin as very teeny tiny lymphatic capillaries. So the lymphatic capillaries are found in capillary beds. And they are very small. They've got simple squamous epithelial tissue, but it's kind of arranged in a unique fashion where our cells are overlapping each other like shingles. And they are not joined by tight junctions so that fluid can flow right in. So these are squamous epithelial cells. That overlap each other to form valves. So if you look at a lymphatic capillary, you would have these cells that are kind of arranged like shingles, overlapping each other. And what that does is it allows for the one-way movement of fluid into them but not back out. So fluid can come in, but since the cells are arranged that way, it can't go back out. So they allow for one-way movement of fluid into our lymphatic capillaries. So all of our little lymphatic capillaries are going to converge and form the next type of lymphatic vessel, our lymphatic collecting vessels. And our lymphatic collecting vessels are going to pass by lymph nodes at specific body regions so that the immune cells there can be filtering that lymph and testing it to see what's going on. So we've got collecting vessels, are our next type of lymphatic vessels. And these are larger. They have composition similar to veins. They've got tunica intima that has valves that will prevent the backflow of lymph. And so these are larger. They're similar to veins. They contain valves. And the tunica intima. They have a thin tunica media with a little bit of smooth muscle and some connective tissue. And then their tunica externa is continuous with the tunica externa of the arteries and veins they're running with. So they've got a tunica media with a little smooth muscle. And they've got some collagen fibers. And then their tunica externa is continuous with the veins and arteries they're running with. So it's that areolar connective tissue that's anchoring them to the vessels that they're traveling with. The last thing that I would say about our collecting vessels is that they run by they run by lymph nodes at prescribed points in the body so that our lymph can run past those immune cells, and if there's anything in it, we can start an immune response right there. Our collecting vessels are going to merge and become our next biggest type of lymphatic vessel, our lymphatic trunks. I should say all of our collecting vessels will dump into lymphatic trunks. These are larger vessels that drain our collecting vessels. We've got 6, and they're named according to their location. So we've got a left and right jugular trunk. We've got a left and right subclavian trunk. Left and right what's called bronchomediastinal. Trunk. Then we've got our left and right intercostal trunks. Left and right intestinal trunks. And left and right lumbar trunks. All of our lymphatic trunks are going to dump into one of 2 lymphatic ducts. So, and our lymphatic ducts are going to return lymph to the subclavian veins. So our largest lymphatic vessels are lymphatic ducts. So they're our largest vessels that drain lymphatic trunks. And we've got 2. The right lymphatic duct. And the only thing that the right lymphatic duct is draining is the right side of your head, the right side of your thorax, and your right arm. Then our other large collecting duct is our thoracic duct. And this drains all of the rest of the body. So those are all of our different lymphatic vessels. But we also have a bunch of different lymphatic tissues and organs. So they're going to be associated with either producing our white blood cells or housing stores of white blood cells so that we can release them when needed. Or like your tonsils they're very similar to lymph nodes, but they're filtering everything that's coming in your mouth and your nose. So those were all of our different types of vessels. On the right side of your picture on figure 21.1, you can see all of our lymphatic tissues and organs. So we'll talk about those. I'll just kind of give you the names of them all now, and then we'll work through their functions and things with the figure numbers that go with your book. So on the right side of that picture, you can see what are called your primary structures. Our primary structures are the structures that are directly involved with producing white blood cells. So the bone marrow makes all of our blood cells. So that's one. So this makes all blood cells, including our leukocytes. The thymus is also considered a primary structure because it's maturing a specific type of leukocyte, T cells. So this is where the maturation of T cells occurs. Other secondary structures would be your tonsils. We've got 3 sets we'll look at in a little bit. Your lymph nodes, which are found all over the place. Talk about those in a bit as well. Your spleen stores large amounts of white blood cells, so it's a secondary structure. And then this stuff called MALT, which is mucosal associated lymphatic tissue. So it's spread, or it's found diffuse throughout the body in mucosal membranes, which helps to kind of act as this barrier. Our mucosal membranes are a good physical barrier for the entrance of pathogens, and if we've got some lymphatic tissue present, then we can initiate an immune response if need be. So in green up here are our primary structures, and red down here are our secondary structures. Alright, so figure 21.2 is showing you lymphatic capillaries and the relationship of them to a regular capillary bed. So if you look at a capillary bed, we've got our arteriole that's leading into it, we've got our venule that's leading away from it, we've got all the little tiny capillaries in between that we're having our fluid and gas exchange across. And in here, in the capillary bed, you'll have these lymphatic vessels sticking into it. And they are picking up the remainder of the fluid that doesn't get picked up by reabsorption in the venous side of the capillary bed. And so these little guys are the lymphatic capillaries, and if you look at their structure, they're like closed-ended tubes. In our blood vessel system, our arterioles are always leading the capillary bed, always leading into a venule, back to the heart, and so we've got this big, long system with one-way movement of fluid, and nothing's really closed-ended. It's all continuous with each other. In our lymphatic capillaries, they are closed-ended. They're closed-ended tubes that have this shingle-like overlapping of cells that's going to allow for the one-way movement of fluid in, but not back out. So the fluid can squeeze back in there, but then if it were to try and push back out, then those cells would kind of, like valves, kind of snap back onto each other. So our lymphatic capillaries allow for the one-way movement of lymph, or of interstitial fluid into the lymphatic capillaries. And as soon as that fluid gets in there, then we call it lymph. Alright, figure 21.3 just kind of shows you all of your different lymphatic trunks and ducts. And so what you can see in that figure is that if you look down at the inferior portion of the figure where we've got our lymphatic trunks, our lumbar trunks coming into, they're going to come and they're at the inferior portion, kind of behind the small intestine. We've got this enlarged region called the cisterna chyli. So the cisterna chyli is found posterior to your small intestine. Your small intestine had those lacteals that were picking up our lipids from your diet. So the cisterna chyli is this region that those lacteals dump into. So we'll say for the cisterna chyli, our lacteals dump lipids into it. And then if we look past that, leading up is our big thoracic duct. Our thoracic duct is going to drain most of the rest of our lymphatic trunks, and then it dumps into the left subclavian vein. So the thoracic duct dumps into left subclavian vein. Our right lymphatic duct dumps into our right subclavian vein. This should make you think about eating fats in a different way. If we absorb the fats from our diet into lacteals, and the lacteals dump into the cisterna chyli, which is draining lymph, or which is running our lymph passage into our thoracic duct, and our thoracic duct is dumping straight into our subclavian vein, then that means all of the fats that you eat hit your blood before they have the chance to be filtered. So all of the rest of your nutrient types, everything else that you eat, gets put through the hepatic portal system and your liver filters it first. Fats do not get filtered first. They enter your lymph and get dumped straight into your blood. So if we were to look at the flow of lymph, it begins as interstitial fluid. So we could say interstitial fluid goes into our lymphatic capillaries. Now it's lymph. So this lymph will continue into our collecting vessels. And then those collecting vessels will dump into our lymphatic trunks. From the lymphatic trunks, we will go right into collecting ducts. And from the collecting ducts, straight into your subclavian veins. So next, we can talk about our primary lymphatic organs, our bone marrow, and our thymus. So all of our lymphocytes are produced in the bone marrow. The bone marrow produces all leukocytes. We've got two types of leukocytes that are involved in specific immunity, B cells and T T cells. So when we go through the immune system for the next chapter, it'll all become more clear. But for specific immunity, we have B cells, which fight extracellular pathogens by releasing antibodies, and they mature in the bone marrow. Our T cells fight intracellular pathogens, and they have to go to the thymus for maturation. So the thymus has special cells that are going to show our T cells how to recognize self. And so we'll talk about that with the next chapter, but they must travel to the thymus for maturation. So your thymus, if we look at where your thymus is located, then it sits on top of the heart, and it's very important in children where they have to develop what's called their T cell repertoire. So the thymus in children is large because they are developing what's called the T cell repertoire. It becomes involuted as an adult, which means that it mostly gets replaced by adipose tissue. And you'll be able to see that in the slides that you look at today. You'll be able to tell an adult versus a child because a child has a lot of cells in it still. And in an adult, it is a lot of adipose tissue. Alright, so as far as secondary lymphatic structures go, lymph nodes are the most abundant type of lymphatic organ that we have. So lymph nodes are going to be our next type of organ. These are secondary structures. And they are the most abundant or most numerous. They're found at prescribed places along lymphatic vessel pathways so that they can filter lymph that's coming through them. So if we look at the structure of a lymph node, then it's got this kind of outer capsule surrounded by collections of cells. We've got T cells and B cells in high numbers in here. And what will happen if we look at the structure, we'll have many what are called afferent vessels that bring a lot of lymph into the lymph node, and then that lymph will be filtered past all of our immune cells and collected in an afferent vessel. So all of these are, I don't know if I said it right, they get collected in the efferent vessel. So these are afferent vessels, and they are going to bring lymph to the node. And then all of that lymph from several afferent vessels will be filtered past our immune cells and collected into an efferent lymph vessel that will then go and become an afferent for some other lymph node, so that it will get filtered several times before it gets back to the subclavian veins. And the job of our lymph nodes is to filter lymph that's coming past, so that if there's any bacteria in it, we can start an immune response right there in the lymph node. We can start proliferating immune cells so that we can get a nice immune response going. There are lymph nodes found kind of all over the place, but we've got some at some prescribed places that you should know. Cervical lymph nodes you can find in superficial and deep in the neck. So we've got both deep and superficial. In the neck. We also have axillary lymph nodes, which are found in your axillary region. We have thoracic lymph nodes that are found all throughout the thoracic cavity, but especially in the mediastinum. So thoracic lymph, or axillary lymph nodes are really just found in the axillary region. Thoracic are found throughout the thorax, and especially mediastinum. Why would that be important in the mediastinum? Right, because your heart's in there, inside the pericardium in there. We also have abdominal lymph nodes. We have intestinal and mesenteric lymph nodes. I'm going to move to the top now. So intestinal found throughout the intestines, mesenteric in that connective tissue that's holding all your intestines together. So our abdominal are found in your abdominal pelvic wall, and your mesenteric are found in your mesenteries. So these are filtering lymph that's coming from your abdominal organs, your urinary bladder, all of that. Then we've got inguinal lymph nodes found in the inguinal region, and popliteal lymph nodes found in the popliteal region. There are also brachial lymph nodes. Your book doesn't list them.
You said intestinal as well, right?
Oh, yeah. Sorry. We'll go up here by our abdominal. So our intestinal, abdominal, and mesenteric are all kind of filtering the stuff that's going through your guts. Inguinal, monitoring lymph coming from the leg, as is the popliteal, monitoring lymph coming from your leg. So these are located kind of at key locations. So if you hurt your arm, you can, if you cut your arm and bacteria gets in, it can be filtered pretty quickly before it gets back to your subclavian veins, before that bacteria just enters the lymph. If you step on something and you get bacteria in your foot, then it can be picked up in your popliteal and then filtered again in your inguinal. If you eat something that has bacteria in it, we can filter it in the abdominal region. So they're pretty cool. Then our next lymphatic organ is the spleen. This is also a secondary structure. The spleen houses large amounts of both red and white blood cells. This is the largest lymphatic organ. And it's got red and white pulp, we call it. Red pulp has large amounts of erythrocytes. And white pulp has large amounts of white blood cells. Primarily lymphocytes and macrophages. All right, so next are our tonsils. We've got 3 sets of tonsils, and they are like lymph nodes. They're similar to lymph nodes, but they're found at the back of your nasal cavity and your oral cavity. So they are, they contain white blood cells that are going to be able to filter everything that's coming in, either through your nose or through your mouth. So we've got 3 sets of tonsils. So these are similar lymph nodes. And we've got the superiormost set is called your pharyngeal tonsils. And this is monitoring things coming in through your nasal cavity. So we'll say monitors the mucus that's coming past from the nasal cavity. Our next set is called our palatine tonsils. And these are found back near your soft palate. And they are monitoring your saliva or whatever you're swallowing from your oral cavity. And then your last set are your lingual tonsils that are also monitoring things coming in from your oral cavity. So in this model here, we can see our pharyngeal tonsils up here and our palatine tonsils back here, but it doesn't really have a good image of our lingual tonsils. So this would be testable for your pharyngeal and your palatine tonsils, but not really for lingual tonsils. The last type of secondary lymphatic structure we have, there's not a picture of in your book, but we have these little things called lymphatic nodules, and they're associated with this other stuff called malt. Lymphatic nodules are really just like small little clusters of lymphatic tissues. They're like mini lymph nodes. And then the last stuff that we have is that malt, the mucosal associated lymphatic tissue, and this is throughout your mucosal membranes, and it's going to be able to give a wide diffuse barrier so that if stuff gets through your integument and hits your mucosal linings, at least there's some lymphatic tissue there. So this provides some immunity in your mucosal membranes. Mucosal membranes are like your second physical barrier, your first being your skin. So if you get past the skin and you get to your mucosal membranes, then at least we've got some lymphatic tissue there so that we can get some immune cells there if need be. So the last thing that we need to talk about as far as physiology goes is the movement of fluid into our lymphatic capillaries. So what causes the movement of that fluid into our lymphatic capillaries? How does it happen? And then what happens as a result? So what kind of pressure do you think it is? If this is our interstitial fluid out here, and we have 15% remaining after capillary exchange. Then this 15% is going to be picked up in the lymphatic vessels. What kind of pressure do you think it is on the fluid to move in? Is it osmotic pressure? Is it hydrostatic pressure?
Hydrostatic.
It's hydrostatic pressure. So we've got this pressure of the fluid on these vessels and it'll move it in. So hydrostatic pressure moves extracellular fluid into the capillaries. Now, as far as moving through the rest of our vessels, from our capillaries, let's say, into our, or through our larger vessels, we've got a couple different forces acting on it. So we'll say that this next part is movement of lymph through larger vessels. What is going to cause this? So there's actually, they have a little bit of, the larger vessels have a little bit of smooth muscle in them. So it's possible as you stretch a larger vessel that then the muscle will contract back. So there's a slight rhythmic contraction as lymph expands the muscle and the muscle, or expands the vessel, then the muscle contracts back. So the first force would be slight rhythmic contraction. Due to the smooth muscle squeezing back on the fluid that was pushing out on them. The other forces that are going to act on lymph moving through our larger vessels are the same forces that were acting on venous blood. So the skeletal muscle pump, our respiratory pump, and then actually as the blood is flowing past in the subclavian veins, it kind of creates this suction and sucks it out of our lymphatic ducts. So that would be the last pressure acting on lymph in our larger vessels from those ducts the blood flowing through the subclavian veins creates kind of like a suction that pulls the lymph from those lymphatic ducts into the veins. And then the last thing to talk about as far as physiology goes is that we do have this flow of lymph through our lymph nodes. Again, we've got several afferent lymph nodes that will lead into a lymph node. Afferent, you can think of afferent as approaching, efferent is exiting. So we'll have several afferent lymph nodes. We'll bring our lymph in. It'll filter past our immune cells. So if we need to start an immune response, then we can. If we've got a bacteria or a virus in here, then there are immune cells that can filter it. After it's been filtered, it will enter into an efferent vessel. This efferent would then become an afferent for some other lymph node. So like in the example of your foot, you step on a nail and there's bacteria or toxins in the system, then that lymph will go in afferent vessels to your popliteal lymph nodes. You'll filter it, it'll exit through an efferent vessel, it'll be filtered again in your inguinal lymph nodes, and then it will be collected ultimately in your lumbar trunk. So, and there's a figure at the end of your chapter that kind of sums up which structures are associated and assisting with the cardiovascular system and which are assisting with the immune system. So as far as cardiovascular system is concerned, we've got to get that fluid back to our blood. So 15% of that interstitial fluid gets left behind, and if it doesn't get returned to the blood, then you get what's called edema. So our little lymphatic capillaries are going to pick up that extra interstitial fluid, and they're going to bring it to lymphatic vessels that are going to dump into our lymphatic trunks and ducts that bring it back to the subclavian vein. As far as fat absorption goes, your lacteals kind of help with absorbing that and getting that, or taking it from the small intestine and getting that to the lymph so that it can be added to the blood. The spleen assists with the cardiovascular system because it's got red pulp that contains large numbers of erythrocytes that are going to be important for oxygen transport. There are systems that assist, or the organs that are assisting with the immune system, and this is what actually most of our lymphatic organs are going to be helping with. Our red bone marrow is producing our lymphocytes, our leukocytes that are part of the immune response. Our thymus is maturing our T lymphocytes. Secondary structures, our lymph nodes are filtering our lymph. They're monitoring it for foreign materials coming through and in your body. Your spleen has the white pulp that has large stores of leukocytes, and it's also monitoring your blood for different bacteria, viruses, different pathogens. Your tonsils are providing for immune recognition or immune filtering of things coming in through your nose or your mouth. And then you've got lymphatic tissue spread throughout your mouth that helps to protect your organs and your mucosal linings from different types of pathogens.